You're listening to Romancing in Paris on Paris Underground Radio.
Hello, and welcome to the Romancing in Paris podcast. I'm your host, Lily Heise. In this podcast, we'll be traveling around the city as I pick out my top romantic spots per arrondissement. You don't have to visit these places only as a couple. Exploring them can be the expression of your own love of Paris. Are you ready to get romancing in Paris?
Hello, and welcome back to a new episode of Romancing in Paris. Our romantic foray of the left bank continues in this new episode as we drift from the 14th to the 15th district. We're going to visit a place which is both romantic and intrinsically linked to the history of the arrondissement, something which I aim to do as much as possible. And, as regular listeners will know, I like to have a variety of venues in the podcast, and I usually include at least one museum in each season, as there are a number of wonderfully romantic museums in the city, usually the smaller, lesser visited ones. This should give you a little hint as to the type of venue we'll be visiting in this episode. Our venue is part of a unique family of museums which you can visit in Paris, art studio museums. And the one we're going to today is romantic in many, many ways, including a surprising love story I uncovered about the particular artist in question. Grab your chérie, we're going to the Musée Bourdelle. Back in the early 20th century, the then working-class Montparnasse area began attracting an increasing number of artists. Many of those who made the district an artistic mecca were from Eastern Europe, like Soutine, Chagall, and Zadkine. As of the late teens, the area became the artistic and bohemian center of Paris. Studio complexes like La Ruche also flourished in the vicinity, and the Boulevard de Montparnasse was lined with bustling cafes where the who's who in Paris liked to hang out. This was the grand heyday of Montparnasse, but what few people know is that there were actually artists in the area much earlier, as far back as the mid-19th century. For example, Rue Notre-Dame-des-Champs was lined with art studios and residences of other creatives. The trickle-down effect disseminated to neighboring streets. Indeed, a mere few blocks away is one of these early art studios, which is open to the public, the former studio of sculptor Antoine Bourdelle. Although he mightn't be a household name, Bourdelle was a very important sculptor in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly known for his large-scale, robust figures. I'd first visited this museum quite a long time ago, and ever since I first discovered it, I like to pop by now and then. The City of Paris Museum, it's free to enter, save for when temporary exhibits are on, making it that much more enticing, especially for romantics on a budget. I've always loved the ambiance of this museum. Yet, it wasn't until I was researching the episode that I learned more about this artist, colossal in size and perhaps in heart. We will learn more about the personal life of Antoine Bourdelle in due course. Émile Antoine Bourdelle was born in 1861 in the southwestern French city of Montauban to a furniture maker father and the daughter of a weaver. Antoine much preferred drawing to academics, something his elementary teacher actually encouraged, allowing him to draw in a separate area of the classroom while the others focused on books. And thus it was so that at 13 he started an apprenticeship at his father's workshop and was taking drawing lessons in the evenings. His talent for wood sculpture was quickly noticed, and when he was only 15, a local banker called Hypothète Lacaze gave Antoine a scholarship to study at the Académie des Beaux-Arts of Toulouse. He threw himself entirely into his art, working day and night. His intense efforts paid off, as in 1884, Antoine got accepted into the École nationale supérieure des beaux-arts in Paris, and 2 years later he rented what was then a very modest studio space at 16 Impasse du Maine, where he worked and expanded upon until his death in 1929. To earn a living while he focused on his own art, he sold drawings and also worked for art dealer Theo van Gogh. Yes, indeed, the very brother of the sunflower painting star Vincent. Bourdelle turned his attention to his own art when he could, and in 1893 he began working as an assistant sculptor in the workshop of Auguste Rodin, where he also overlapped with Camille Claudel. If you're interested in learning more about Claudel and her relationship with Rodin, tune into episode 30 of the podcast. It's also quite a romantic story. 10 years later, Antoine had built himself a solid enough career that he could dedicate himself to his own art. Or did it really have his complete and full attention? He also had taken on a Greek sculpture student, Cléopâtre Sevastos. I'm not sure if it was love at first sight or not, but Bourdelle really fell for his pretty Greek student, who also modeled for him. The issue, however, was that, much like Rodin's story with Camille Claudel, Bourdelle was seeing another woman, Stéphanie van Parijs, whom he ended up marrying the following year in 1904. Perhaps because she was pregnant with their future child, Pierre Bourdelle, who would follow in his father's footsteps as a sculptor. Even after getting married, Antoine kept using Cléopâtre as a model for his works, something which terribly angered Stéphanie, likely with good reason. The couple's relationship fell apart, and they eventually got divorced in 1910. But Antoine didn't waste too much time before quickly marrying Cléopâtre, who obviously had retained his heart, with whom he had a daughter, Rhodia. As for Cléopâtre, she did have a start of a sculpting career of her own, and even had a work accepted for the Salon d'Automne of 1909, the famed art exhibit which took place annually. Yet, after she and Antoine married, she put her own career on the side. As for Antoine's career, it continued to mature, and he collaborated with Rodin by starting a school together in the area. He also began teaching sculpture at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière, a school which still exists. Among his students was the renowned Swiss sculptor Alberto Giacometti, who also established himself in the Montparnasse area. Commissions and exhibits of his work also increased, and he worked on many prestigious buildings, including the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées here in Paris. Antoine died in 1929 and lies in rest a mere few blocks away from his studio in the Montparnasse Cemetery. However, already prior to his death, he was thinking ahead and had foreseen converting his studio into a museum. In the early 1930s, a collector of Bourdelle's work, Gabriel Cognac, the nephew and heir of Ernest Cognac, the owner of the Saint-Maritain department store, provided the funds to buy up the studio, which thankfully ensured that the works remaining in the artist's possession were not dispersed. It took a little while, yet the museum was eventually opened and was inaugurated in 1949. Then it was expanded upon a few times. The gallery made of bricks was actually constructed using bricks from his native Montauban. Today, the museum has more than 500 works of the artist, ranging from marble, plaster, and bronze statues, as well as paintings, drawings, and pastels. It also holds Bourdelle's own personal collection of art, including pieces by top artists of the era like Eugène Delacroix, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, and his friend Auguste Rodin.
If you're enjoying this episode of Romancing in Paris, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Paris: A State of Mind, a wonderful show about the ins and outs of renting or buying property in Paris. Romancing in Paris will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Romancing in Paris.
I think it's time we stop by for a visit, don't you agree? Something I should give you a piece of advice. The museum will be reopening after some works. So if you're visiting it in the near future of the publication of this episode, it will only reopen on the 15th of March. Listening to this afterwards, feel free to stop by during regular opening hours. You can get to the museum either from the Montparnasse side or a few back streets from Métro Fougères will get you there too. This is my preferred way. That way you can avoid the horrible Tour Montparnasse. The entrance is now modern, but it gives way into a pretty garden, home to benches flanked by greenery, from which you can admire several bronzes by the artist, including Le Fouilles, Adam, and Penelope. You might end up circling back to the garden at the end, and instead start with the Great Hall of Plaster Casts. This space was built in the 1960s, where an adjacent studio once stood, that of another sculptor, Jules Deleu. This has monumental works, plaster casts that were created by Antoine for commissioned work in other places. Visitors may then want to visit the temporary exhibition space, or work their way around to the back, where Bourdelle's studio was. The atmosphere remains intact, and visitors can see some of his casts, sculptures, sculpting pedestals, and other equipment. It gives the feeling that the artist has simply taken a little coffee break and could return at any moment. Although I'm fond of the front garden, it's the back garden, found between the studio spaces, that is particularly intimate. There are little romantic alcoves, benches, and overall a serene ambiance prevails. Since the museum is never too busy, especially during the week, you won't be distracted, and you will have this wonderful setting, perhaps even all to yourself. It's a perfect place for some romancing, and you can even think back to when Cléopâtre and Antoine might have been sitting in the same spot themselves. Before leaving, be sure to pop into the artist's humble former apartments, found facing the front garden. The cozy and simple spaces offer an intimate look into the personal life of the artist. Once you're done at the museum, you can carry on your homage to Bourdelle by visiting his grave in the nearby Montparnasse Cemetery, where you'll also find a range of other romantics, including fellow sculptor Brancusi or Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre, and the rocker Serge Gainsbourg. If you've really fallen in love with Bourdelle's work, you might like to visit the second museum in his honor, created by his heirs in Ergueville, which displays 56 of his sculptures and also includes a lovely garden. Thank you for listening to this latest episode of Romancing in Paris. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. That way you won't miss the next one. Ratings or reviews get a big je t'aime from me. And if you would like to discover more romantic places in Paris, see my website jetaimemeneither.com. This podcast was produced by Paris Underground Radio. Check out their website if you're interested in listening to more great podcasts on Paris. In the meantime, happy romancing in Paris.
This episode of Romancing in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.